Be seated. Exciting to look at the book of Esther. Now, as we look at the book, there's some interesting things we note about the book. Oh, and by the way, we're getting ahead of ourselves. John last week did Nehemiah, all the book of Nehemiah. So tonight we're doing all the book of Esther. So you will be about a week ahead on Wednesday nights. The ladies will still be following the regular schedule. And the way this works out, since we won't have the Wednesday night study on Christmas Day, then we'll be in good shape. So we're just planning ahead here a little bit. But about the book here, what's really interesting, which you may have noted before, is that the name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not at all. But his hand, his unseen hand, we see throughout the entire book as they're obviously depending upon the Lord, but they're not openly speaking of him. So we see God's hand on of protection throughout the book. Now, we're going to be going through all 10 chapters tonight. So as we jump into this, first of all, it says, now it had come to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now, the identification of who Ahasuerus was, there's some disagreement about it, but it seems that it was Xerxes. Now, and the reason is, one of the reasons is, you might, and his son is Artaxerxes. Now, just looking at it in English, it looks like there's a connection between Xerxes and Artaxerxes as far as the names go. But actually, as far as the language, the original language, there's a closer tie with Ahasuerus and Xerxes in the root of the names. So that's why it's more likely that it's him who reigned from 486 to 465, being the strongest of the kings there. And the interesting thing about that, if this is true and the way it plays out, is of course his wife later is Esther. And after his reign, then Artaxerxes comes, and he's the one who gives the decree to go, to rebuild. So you could see how her influence as the queen mother would be strong, not that he was her son, but that probably stepmother, but being the queen mother, because she was married to the king previously. So he has this wide reign here. And as I said, he was very powerful at this time. And it says in verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne in his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all the officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces before him. Now, what this feast is It's a celebration feast in preparation to, this is when they're getting ready to go against the Greek Empire. What's the name of that movie? Yeah, 300. That deals with that. But they're going on there, they're building themselves up, having basically a pep rally here, and for what's going to take place, they believe. And so he throws this party of all these people, and then as we see down in the chapter, you know, they're having this party for days, and then finally, you know, they're eating and drinking for so many days, and okay, what do we do now? Oh, my wife is so beautiful. Let's bring her in here. And the idea behind that is, yes, he's showing off his greatness, showing how beautiful his wife is. But remember, in the culture over there, he's expecting her to come out there in public unveiled. And so, you know, it's kind of indiscreet. It's, you know, he's doing this probably out of a lack of judgment, having partied too long. And so she refuses to come. She refuses to come to the party. She's partying with the ladies, probably the wives of all those guys who were in the party with the king. And she just simply refuses to come at the king's order through his servants. And so there's this problem suddenly comes up now because of this. And as it says in verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. And the king said to his wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. Those closest to him being, and he gives a list of names there, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in his kingdom. And here's the question: what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she did not obey the command of Ahasuerus, that King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. Then Memucan answered and said before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all the women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti to be brought in before him, and she did not come. So the whole thing, the discussion there in the halls of Congress, basically, in the empire, was what to do with Vashti, because she refused to do what the king said. And so they have this discussion. Yeah, this is going to be bad, because if you let her get away with it, all of our wives will be rebelling too. So we have to do something. Then in verse 19 it says, if it pleases the king, let the royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all the empire, for it is great, all the wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. Now, if you're waiting for a legal decree to keep your house together, you got a problem. You know, if you need a decree from a king and the princes how you're to live in your life, you know, as a family, you have a problem. So, as it said in verse 21, and the reply pleased the king, the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters, and they did all this. Now, so he's basically deposes her. Now, you have to remember, and we'll see this as it plays out with the interviews of all of the girls to take her place, is that Ahasuerus had a harem. And so the queen was one that was chosen, but what probably happened here is they just basically sent her back to the harem, and he never saw her again, basically. She was taken care of, but she was out of the public eye, and she was just one of the girls in the harem. Now, chapter 2, it says, after these things, this is 4 years later, and because of the war with Greece, that unsuccessful invasion of Greece, he's then, you know, after that, he's kind of over that right now. He's trying to shift his attention. As it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, that what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be brought before the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. And then it says in verse 5, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So he's related distantly to King Saul, being a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives. This isn't Kish, Saul's father, but it's another Kish in the line. So he had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And as I said, this is roughly around when that took place. The carrying away was 605. And this is the generations after that. So, verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. Now, Hadassah means myrtle, like the plant. the bush, myrtle. And Esther means star. And she was his uncle's daughter, so Mordecai is the cousin of Esther. For she had neither, so he brought her up because she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and the decree was heard, and the women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now, the young woman pleased him. Now, she gets in good with Hegai, and he gives her the best of the preparations, tells her exactly what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And so they have this time to train them. Where they did a certain amount of time, they put oils on, a certain amount of time, they did all of these other things for months. So then in verse 9 it says, then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Gave her the best apartment. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Don't tell anybody you're a Jew. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So each young woman's turn came to go before King Ahasuerus after she had completed the 12 months of preparation. Boy, husbands, you think your wife takes a long time to put on makeup. 12 months. According to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation, 6 months with the oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went before the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. So you see, if she went into the king, he wasn't really pleased with her. They then just switched quarters over, and she was a concubine after that. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abahaliah, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. Now, so that's the beginning. That's the setup. Now things begin to happen, which is interesting that they really have no control over in this sense. One is, the first thing we see in the rest of this chapter is that it says, in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, which he regularly did, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So she told the king specifically about this plot and said that Mordecai had revealed it to her. So those were taken, the matter was investigated, they found him guilty, and they hung them. Now, it seems like a minor incident at the moment, but it plays into the story later. Now, chapter 3, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. Now, this is really important. It might not seem like it, but it says here specifically, it's Haman the Agagite. What's an Agagite? Rock, doesn't it? No. What it is this takes us back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Remember when Samuel told Saul he was to completely wipe out the Amalekites because of how they had taken advantage of and abused the children of Israel from the time they came out of Egypt. They would follow along as they were coming into the land. As they were coming, they would come along behind, and the weak and the elderly, they would attack on the backside of the camp. And so they were always the constant enemy of Israel. They were treacherous. They would, attack in that way. So God, through Samuel, tells Saul to completely wipe them out. And wipe out, not even bring their sheep or cattle, wipe the whole thing out. Then he does attack. It says there that he kept some of the best of the cattle and the sheep, and he kept the king alive. Anybody remember what the king's name is? Agag. So, and that's when Samuel comes and Saul declares, I've kept the command of the Lord. And he says to him, if you kept the word of the Lord, what's this bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle I hear? Since you've rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you from being king. And obviously, Saul was lying to some extent, maybe greater than it's indicated in that chapter, because either he didn't kill all the descendants or all the family of Agag, or within the intermittent period, he had another son, because Haman is a descendant of Agag. He's an Agagite. He's an Amalekite. The constant enemy of the children of Israel. This is even before really, the Philistines were. They continued longer as well. So this is 600 years later, after that incident, that are still dealing with it. And the interesting thing, if you're looking at what this represents and what the type is here, the Amalekites are usually, related to, in analogy, the life of the flesh. That if you don't deal with it completely, it's going to come back and destroy you. If you don't deal with those areas of your flesh, if you don't bring every thought captive, you don't bring all of this down, considers yourself dead to sin and alive to God, then those things will come back and destroy you. There's no compromising with the flesh. So, with him, it says, let's see, in the king's servants, verse 2, all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed down, did homage to Haman, and the king had commanded, as the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. He refuses to bow down to anybody but the Lord. He wouldn't bow to anybody. And that really irritated Haman because he was enjoying his position. Now, because of this, he gets in his mind, as it says in verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him that of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So he wanted to wipe out. Look at this. This comes from Saul's disobedience. Almost got the entire nation destroyed simply because he didn't obey the word of the Lord. Verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur. That doesn't mean they threw the cat. But a pur is a lot. It's like rolling dice. Before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Now, the idea here is they're seeking the gods' approval. They're seeking guidance from the gods of exactly when to do this, so the gods' favor will be upon what they want to do. It's like trying to sanctify what you're doing by attaching God to it in some way. They tried to attach their gods to it. And then Haman goes to the king and says, there's these people here that are in your kingdom that are really strange. They don't worship your gods. They don't pay attention to your laws. They're just a real plague. It's kind of like the anti-Semitic people describe the Jews today. Very similar. And so he gets the king to sign a decree, and it goes out through all the land to all the provinces, that on this particular day that everybody's to rise up against the Jews and kill them. Now, chapter 4 says, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out in the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud, bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So then what takes place is Esther's maids and eunuchs tell her about this, about Mordecai being out there. So she sends to Mordecai. She sends clothes. Hey, change your clothes. Come in here. Let's talk about it. He says, I'm not going to do it. This is serious what's going on there. So they kind of relay information back and forth. He tells her what's going on there, tells all that happened to him, and he sends a copy of the decree to her as well. And so in verse 13 it says, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all other Jews. For if you remain silent, because what was taking place here, he wanted her to go to the king and intercede, but she said, there's this rule here, there's this law. If you go to the king without being asked, if he doesn't want to see you, it's not only they close the door on you, they execute you. They were serious about not being disturbed. And so she tells Mordecai this, and that's why she then says, don't think if this comes down that you're going to escape just because you're in the palace. For if you remain completely silent at this time, verse 14, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And here's that very important verse that we can apply to ourselves as well. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's why I say, even though the name of God isn't mentioned in here, you see his hand throughout the whole thing. And Mordecai acknowledging that, saying that, hey, the Jews are God's people. If you don't help them, God will use somebody else, but you'll miss out. And you'll actually be destroyed. God's going to protect the Jewish people. Now, that's why it's so crazy and why it's important with America's foreign policy that we support Israel. Because they're God's chosen people for his purposes. They will remain until the end. And obviously, in these times, God has used the United States a great deal to help and support Israel. But there's going to be a time when we no longer do that. And that's when I truly believe that it's when either America is destroyed or becomes irrelevant. It's because we've turned our backs on Israel, and so God's removed his hand of protection from us in that. You see, that's what the politicians fail to understand. It was really interesting. I started watching last night. It's one of those things when you're on YouTube, and notice something, you start watching it, and you end up staying up later than you wanted to. But what it was interesting. It was, Jordan Peterson, the developmental psychologist is what he is. On his podcast, he had Greg Laurie, they had a really interesting conversation because he was talking about, Peterson has just written this book about Abraham and, kind of like how we all struggle along as Abraham. And so I thought it was really funny and kind of a, interesting sort of way that he was giving all these psychological perspectives on all of this. And Greg Laurie speaks up and he says, yeah, God spoke to Abraham. It's like Peterson was trying to give all these naturalistic explanations and all this, what was happening psychologically and everything. And Greg Laurie keeps inserting God into the conversation. And it's not just all this stuff, but it's God. And he gave us testimony throughout the whole thing. And it was just pretty interesting. I haven't watched the whole thing yet, but it was pretty interesting to see the way he handled that. So again, like he says, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. But notice this. She comes to the point here where she puts her life totally in God's hands in the midst of this. To stand up to do the right thing, what really God would have you to do, and leave the consequences to him. And that's so important for us to remember and take and apply to our lives, is our responsibility is to walk in obedience to the Lord, to stand up when he calls us to in various ways, politically or socially or however, giving a witness as he calls us to, and then simply trust him with the outcome. Trust in the faithfulness of God. So, after they fasted for 3 days, Esther does this. She goes in to the king, walks in the door, and right away he acknowledges her. She goes, puts her hand on his scepter, and he receives her. And so he asks, what's your request? I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. Nice guy, generous. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I've prepared for him. And then the king said, bring Haman quickly. So they go. And first, this was a light banquet. It's when we think of banquet, we think of, bring out the pig, the whole thing. But this was more like just wine and desserts. They had wine around and whatever desserts they ate at that time. And so the king asked her, okay, what's your what's your request? And he says, and she says, well, if I found favor in your sight, verse 8, in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So she's saying, okay, you came to dessert. Now let's have a real dinner tomorrow night, and I'll tell you what exactly is on my heart here. So, verse 9 through the rest of the chapter, Haman went out that day joyfully. He thinks he's in so good. I'm in with royalty here. Everything's looking good. I'm rising up in the kingdom. I'm the only one that Queen Esther invited to her party besides the king. And so he goes and he's bragging to his friends and relatives, and he tells them of his great riches and the multitude of his children, verse 11, everything in which the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the land. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to the banquet which he has prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet here's his problem. Mordecai was still sticking in his craw. As he says here, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, here's what you do. Build a gallows 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet high, feet tall. This become a real obvious thing, basically a 75-foot pole sticking up in the desert area there, very arid. And so he builds that there. And he says, let it be built, suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. So go merrily with the king to the banquet. And this thing pleased Haman. And so he had the gallows built. Didn't take long. It's just, you go up 75 feet and that's it. Now, back to what happened before with the conspiracy against Ahasuerus. It says that night the king could not sleep, so he commanded the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Imagine this. He can't sleep. So he asked them to come and bring the Chronicles of the kingdom and start reading them to him. I guess he was hoping that he would bore him so much that he would pass out. Just because you're ringing, so-and-so did this at this time, and this happened, and, it's like some people are with history. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, the two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? At this time, Haman's walking into the court. All right, I'm going to tell the king we need to kill Mordecai. Okay, then the king says to Haman as he comes in, doesn't have a chance to tell the king that yet. Um, so he enters the place to make that suggestion. Then the king's servant said to him, Haman is standing out there. So he's out there. So Haman comes in. The king asks him, what shall be done for the man in whom the king delights to honor? So he's thinking, oh, he's talking about me. He's going to give me more honor. He's going to give me more glory. So Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, here you go. He's waiting there. He's standing before the king. This is what you should do, king. And he's just waiting for him to say, okay, let's do it for you. But what he says is, it says, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman has to lead this horse around the square, declaring about Mordecai. This is what's done for a person who the king desires to honor. And so after this, he's just, furious. And as it says in verse 12 of chapter 6, after Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. And when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends, everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife said to him, listen, these are the same people who told him before, hang him. Now they're saying, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Oh, why didn't you tell me this before? I might not have made such a decision. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet with which Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman go to dine with Queen Esther, and so the king asks for the request, what her request is, and it'll be done. In verse 3, she says, then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss, describing how beneficial it was to have the Jewish people there in the kingdom. So Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" Imagine Haman standing there right now. Think, where's the back door? How can I get out of here? Verse 6, and Esther said, "The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now, at this time, the king starts steaming. He goes out into the garden outside. He's fuming. Haman starts like begging to Esther. The king comes back in. He sees Haman falling across the queen's bed there and says, "You're going to assault my wife too, besides all the other stuff you've done?" It's like, no getting out of this. Where he realized, it says in verse 7, that evil was determined against him by the king. So, it says, now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, verse 9, said to king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai." Oh, the king didn't know about that before. "Who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Now what happens in the rest? Yes, that has been taken care of. Haman's been taken care of. But there's an issue here. When the king, even the kings of the Medes and the Persians, when they declare a law, it cannot be changed. It was different when next year when we get into Daniel and you see the image with starting out with the gold and the silver and progressing down there is speaking of the power and authority of each of the kingdoms. Now, like Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he could do whatever he wanted. He could make a law, he could break it himself, he could do all of that. What his word was the law. But it's different with the Medes and the Persians, is once they enacted a law, and we find that with Daniel as well, because remember, Darius made that declaration that no one, when he was instigated by some of the satraps, that no one can bow to any god but Darius for this month. And then Daniel worships anyway. And then Darius realizes how foolish it was, but he couldn't change it. He couldn't change the law because he already enacted it. That's the situation here. They've already enacted this law. So what they do then is to enact another law to counter that one. See, the first law was that the people could attack the Jews and kill them, take all their stuff, and the money would go into the treasury, sort of thing. Now, the second law that they enact now is giving the Jews everything they need to defend themselves, so no one would dare attack them. And so they counteracted that law. And it's interesting, after this, at the end of verse 17 of chapter 8, it says, Then many of the people of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews came upon them. Whoa. People were converting, realizing, seeing God's hand on the Jews. Many people converted. So, in the rest of this, it speaks of the feast of Purim, which is, again, lots. It's dealing with casting lots. That just then becomes a feast in Israel. It's similar to the way it's celebrated as Halloween is, because people would dress up in costumes. Jewish kids would dress up in costumes. Some, of course, girls would dress up as Esther. Boys would dress up as either Mordecai or Haman if they wanted to be the bad guy. And they would dress up as other things as well. But it was a celebration of God's deliverance of the Jewish people. And this is what is really cool about the feast in Israel. While we're not obligated to keep the feast, as the Jewish people are, what's cool about them is it commemorates God's deliverance of his people at that time. One after the other is a celebration of God's deliverance. And for us, why that's important and what it teaches us is we need to remember how God delivers us, what he's done for us in the past, not to forget those things which he's accomplished on your behalf, because that equips you for the future. I mean, looking at the situation with the building and going into buying a building. It's like we see God, how he's provided, he's done things in the past over and over again. We remember those things that he's done, remember his deliverances, remember the things he's called us to do. It's like in the past, every time we've moved into a different building, we've never really had all the funds to do it. But God always provided. That's not that you act in presumption, but you make sure it's God's leading and you trust him when you do it. So, remembering, because without faith it's impossible to please God, because those who come to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Then in chapter 10, it sums up, short little chapter here, 3 verses. It says, now King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. Peace. You had Haman trying to stir up strife. You had God inserting his people to bring peace. So our place is to represent God in the midst of where we are, to stand up for righteousness, to stand up for him. People might see, like he says, with all of these people wanting to become Jews because they saw what God was doing there. People should want to become Christians because of what they see God doing in our lives. But it requires something of us. It requires us to walk by faith. so that they will have something to see. That they would see and desire for themselves. So let's pray. Father, we thank you so much again for your word. Father, in the example we have here of standing for your truth, Lord, not just for ourselves, but for others as well, that they might see truth, and for our nation. Because unless our nation turns, it's going to be destroyed. And we know prophetically it's necessary ultimately. But Lord, there's so many people in this nation. Lord, we just pray that you work by your grace, work in and through our lives, Lord. Help us to get our eyes off ourselves and our own comfort and look to you and what you're doing, Lord, locally here and in this nation, Father, that we just might be a part of what you're doing in these times. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.